this guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
The sitting of the Foreign Interference Commission is now in session. Commissioner Hogue is presiding. Cette séance de la Commission sur l'ingérence étrangère est maintenant en cours. La commissaire Hogue préside. The time is 9:32. Il est 9h32.
Alors, bonjour, madame.
Bonjour.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning.
Commissioner, it's Linda Morgan, Commission Counsel, and Minister Gould is the first witness today. I'd ask that she be sworn or affirmed, please.
Would you prefer to be affirmed or sworn?
Affirmed.
Okay. May I please have your full name and state your last name for the record? To spell it, please.
Yeah, Karina Gould, Gould.
Thank you. And do you solemnly affirm that the testimony you're about to give today is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much, Counsel. You may proceed.
Thank you. Minister Gould, you were interviewed by Commission Counsel on March 15th, 2024 in a classified space. Is that correct?
Correct.
Can I have WIT 62, please? And this is a copy of the publicly disclosable contents of that interview. Have you had an opportunity to review the summary?
I have, yes.
And do you have any changes to make to the summary?
I do. Paragraph 13, the second sentence. Shall I read it?
Let's go down to paragraph 13 first. It is on page 5.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes.
So to change it to, she recalls meeting with representatives from many of the agencies that became members of the Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections Task Force, site TF, including CSE, CSIS, and GAC-RRM, as well as, and that's the extent of the change.
As well as, sorry, I didn't hear the last bit.
No, that's it, as well as the Department of National Defense.
Okay, and PCO as well, does that remain in there?
Yeah, everything else remains the same.
Okay, thank you. And with that change being made, are you prepared to adopt the summary as part of your evidence before the commission today?
I am.
Thank you. So I understand that you have held various cabinet positions since 2017, which include Minister of Democratic Institutions from January 10th, 2017 until November 20th, 2019. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you are the leader of the government in the House of Commons, and you've been in that role since July 26, 2023.
Correct. And I am on maternity leave right
Currently
now.
on parental leave. So I want to first start by asking you about the development of the plan to protect Canada's democracy. And so I just want to ground this in the context of the events that were occurring at the time. So in your witness statement at paragraph 4, you described that the motivation for the creation of the plan came in the context of a series of high-profile attempts by Russia to interfere with democratic elections around the world, primarily through cyber activities and disinformation campaigns. And you've also described that the plan is created against the backdrop of what's described as the Obama dilemma, which is effectively the fact that President Obama could not alert the public about intelligence relating to electoral interference because he was concerned about being viewed as a partisan actor interfering in the electoral process. So does that kind of situate?
Yeah, so I think it's important to recall that in January 2017, it was about 2 months following the U.S. presidential election. There was, considerable activity happening at the international level, and particularly in the United States, following what was seen as, very high level, very sophisticated Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. There had also been other things going on in the world, kind of within the next 6 to 8 months, where we saw, the Brexit vote, where we saw the Macron leaks in France, the cyber attack against the German parliament, and leaks from the Bundestag. So there were a series of very high-profile cyber attacks on fellow democracies around the world. And so when the Prime Minister gave me that mandate, it was very much trying to protect Canadian democracy and Canadian elections from those kinds of high-profile, very sophisticated cyber threats, which at the time were primarily coming from Russia.
And so let's pull up that mandate letter that you received from the Prime Minister. Can I please have COM 18, please? And so this is a letter that I understand you received on February 1st, 2017 from the Prime Minister. I'll just wait for that document to be brought up. COM 18. Thank you. And the document you see on the screen, is this the letter that you received?
Yes.
Okay. And if we can go down to page 3, please. A little bit further down. Thank you. So we see the paragraph starting with, in particular, I will expect you to work with your colleagues and through established legislative, regulatory, and cabinet processes to deliver on your top priorities. And the first bullet lists, in collaboration with the Minister of National Defence and the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, lead the Government of Canada's efforts to defend the Canadian electoral process from cyber threats. This should include asking the Communications Security Establishment, CSE, to analyze risks to Canada's political and electoral activities from hackers and to release this assessment publicly, as well ask CSE to offer advice to Canada's political parties and Elections Canada on best practices when it comes to cybersecurity. I appreciate there's other bullets on that list. I will focus on that one for today. Did you, in relation to this particular aspect of your mandate, did you have any discussions with the Prime Minister about expectations for what the plan should cover and how it should operate?
Well, no, it's pretty clear in the mandate letter what my task was, and to work across government to protect our elections from cybersecurity threats.
And so, the mandate itself is focused on cyber threats. Mm-hmm. Was the developing plan, so the plan to protect Canada's democracy, was that plan restricted to or focused on cyber threats?
No, it ended up being broader than that. How this came about, so, as when you are a minister and you get a mandate letter, this is the job that you're tasked with. It's a job description, so to speak, in terms of what the Prime Minister expects you to accomplish in your time in that portfolio. So I set about gathering information, learning about what the threats were. So I had various meetings with the different heads of agencies to understand what the threats were to Canada, focused on our elections, and through that process, I was presented with other threats to our democracy that included human intelligence, which is what led to the 4 pillars that were released publicly in January 2019 and Canada's broad plan to protect our democracy that ended up bringing in not just the Departments of National Defence and Public Safety, but also global affairs, as well as heritage, so that we had as comprehensive of a plan at the time to deal with the threats as we understood them. But really, it was a process of learning, understanding, engaging, and trying to come up with the plan that could most robustly protect Canada's national federal democracy.
So let me talk to you a bit about that information gathering exercise that you've described. What did you identify or learn were the biggest threats or concerns to which the plan needed to respond?
Sure. So, I think one of the important parts throughout all of this was the understanding that foreign interference or attempts at foreign interference, because I think it's the attempting that has gone on for a long time. Probably in every election that Canada has ever had, there have been attempts at foreign interference, just like in probably every election in a democracy around the world. Probably since ancient Greece, there have been attempts at foreign interference. Whether they're successful or not is another question. And so I think that was one of the most important things. The nature of the threats have evolved over time, and in the period from 2017 to 2019, this was when threats online were becoming more of an issue that people weren't really aware of, and the security agencies themselves were also learning more about. Because if we go back to, the Russian example in the in the United States, they were using social media platforms to try and either elicit a specific outcome in the American election, or even just creating chaos, right? So that people have less trust in democracy, which feeds their interest of a national interest to say that democracy is not something that Russians, for example, should be interested in, because look at the chaos that's happening over there. We want stability. So there's many different interests at play here. The other thing that I learned was of, other countries, for example, that also had an interest, sometimes perhaps in getting a specific candidate elected or not. Whether they were successful, again, is always a question. And then the other part of it is, they may have specific policy objectives as well, or they may have specific objectives with regards to influence operations. And it's really important to note that, foreign countries and actors are engaging in influence operations all the time, but they're overt. That's diplomacy, that's, trying to, have overt conversations in the public, perhaps through the media. And then there's the interference part, which is the stuff that is covert, that they're trying to do in a sneaky way so that Canadians or politicians aren't aware of. So really learned quite a bit about what is going on. I would also say, I think learned that our security agencies are quite sophisticated in Canada and have pretty good knowledge about what is happening, but also recall that, foreign actors are trying to do this in a way so that we don't know about it. And one of the other things that I think is really important that I learned through this process is that we have to be very mindful, and security agencies are, about what information is disclosed publicly, because if they make a decision to disclose something publicly, they're effectively letting the foreign actor know that they know what they're doing. And so they could lose a source, that foreign actor could change what they're doing, they could go further underground. And so we need to be really thoughtful and mindful about how and when and what is released publicly, which also played a really big part in the development of the plan.
And just to ask you specifically about the sources of intelligence or information you relied on, I understand that in your role as minister, you did not receive daily packages of intelligence products.
Correct.
And I understand that you had various briefings and received information from various agencies as well. Is that correct?
Correct.
Can you pull up CAN 13303, please? And go to page 3. So you can see here under the heading Briefings to Ministers, a series of briefings between August 15th, 2018. And can you scroll down a little bit, please? Stopping there is good, thank you. This shows briefings to Minister of Democratic Institutions, as I said, from August 15th, 2018, down through August 23rd, 2019. We see briefings, Director CSIS, Chief CSE. Are those all meetings that you attended?
Well, I'm going to assume that I did, but I wouldn't be able to confirm the exact dates because I don't recall, but I would meet kind of on a monthly, bi-monthly basis with them.
And was the focus of the intelligence that you received focused on cyber threats, or was it broader than that?
The primary focus would be on cyber threats, both in Canada, but also what we were seeing around the world. And the purpose of including around the world is important so that we could learn from other experiences so that we would be able to protect Canada's democracy and elections against those. And there would be, if relevant, high-level descriptions of other potential threats that could include human interference, but they would never be specific. It would be a very general overview, very high level of what the agency was seeing at the time.
Okay. And so in terms of high level, did you ever receive the names of potential threat actors?
Could you clarify that in terms of like?
Did you ever receive names of individuals, for instance?
No.
And did you receive intelligence relating to, like specific intelligence relating to alleged incidents of foreign interference?
Not in specific detail. It would be quite high level.
So in addition to briefings from CSIS and CSC, I understand you also received information from other agencies or entities. From who else did you receive information from?
So CSIS and CSC would be the two primary sources, but the Rapid Response Mechanism at Global Affairs Canada would also generally provide information. And what the RRM does is they worked with G7 and NATO allies to look more broadly around the world to try to identify trends and perhaps identify a threat before it would occur. And so they would kind of tell me what they were seeing around the world and any new trends or threats that they were identifying in the online space and from publicly sourced content.
And in addition to RRM, any other sources?
PCO would also provide intelligence, although I guess this was likely gathered by CSC and CSIS ahead of time.
In relation to PCO, do you know who was responsible for compiling the intelligence or information that was shared with you?
I do not. I would have received it through my deputy minister. I'm not familiar with the chain of command and beyond that.
So I want to move now to the kind of building of the plan, who you collaborated with, and then I'll get into some specific questions about the plan. But I understand from the mandate letter and your witness summary that the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness and National Defense also had some involvement in the development of the plan. Are you able to describe what their involvement was?
Well, what I set out to do as Minister of Democratic Institutions was to come up with a whole of government plan, recognizing that as I learned more about what the threats were, that, we needed to ensure that we had a variety of different departments part of this. So the ministers of national defense and the ministers of public safety were much more in a supportive role, but identifying what their departments could do to support the broader plan. So, for example, under the Minister of Public Safety, obviously, with regards to intelligence priorities, ensuring that cybersecurity in our elections and our democracy was a priority. The RCMP created a specific unit to look at cybersecurity threats in our democracy, updating their other initiatives within public safety to make sure that they had a robust plan. Under defense, the communication security establishment rests, and so they provided opportunities to political parties, parliamentarians, Parliament of Canada, Elections Canada, the Commissioner, even provincial electoral bodies, to say, we can help do an assessment, if you like, of your cybersecurity. They stood up the Cybersecurity Center that part of its mandate was to provide those services, to have a call-in number if individuals or parties had questions with regards to a potential issue. They provided a list of security approved vendors. So there was a whole wide range of different things that they ended up doing to make sure that we were doing everything that we could kind of imagine at the time to safeguard our elections from cyber threats. And then the other thing is that as we learned more, I pulled in Global Affairs Canada through the Rapid Response Mechanism, as well as Heritage Canada, because one of the things that I learned, and I believe very firmly, is that one of the best methods to protect our democracy was a well-informed citizenry. And so as part of that, Heritage Canada had a public education program for citizen engagement and public awareness when it comes to cybersecurity, to really ensure that we were trying to tick all of the boxes. And maybe one other thing that I'll add is through that and through defense, we were put in touch with the NATO Strategic Communications Center, who I then invited to Ottawa to brief the Parliamentary Press Gallery to talk about how they may be able to identify cybersecurity threats, particularly with regards to mis and disinformation. And through that, they brought, for example, a reporter from Finland who was very familiar with Russian interference attempts to be able to brief the press gallery. So we really tried to do this as whole of government as possible, to identify where the different vulnerabilities were in the system, and provide information and support to each of those different actors.
And I understand from your witness statement that you wanted to consult with all of the political parties for their input and feedback in the process. When you say kind of input and feedback, what feedback were you eliciting from the political parties?
So from the get-go, I was engaged with opposition members as well as political parties. I believe in the fall, as early as the fall of 2017, I had meetings with each of my opposition critics, the critics from public safety and of democratic institutions, to talk about the fact that we were building this plan, to get their input as to what they were concerned about, and to let them know that I thought this was something that we needed to have an ongoing dialogue with regards to. Following those initial meetings, my staff met with either staff from the political parties themselves or some of the staff of the critics to keep them informed and engaged throughout the process. And even in my public comments when I announced the plan in 2019, I referenced the fact that I had been engaging with the opposition, the political parties throughout, because I felt it was extremely important that this be nonpartisan and that we have a consensus and build trust in terms of the plan and the process. Because one of the things that you'll note in the protocol, and you may be getting to this, but is that democracy is very fragile, and it rests on trust. It rests on trust of citizens in the process and in the outcome. And so it was vitally important that all political parties be involved in understanding what the plan was going to be and having a sense of comfort of it going into the election, so that if something should arise, we would have a consensus and we would have a comfort to know that that this was being monitored and reviewed, and if there was something that needed to be said, it was coming from a trusted voice and a trusted source. Because what we didn't want to have, you referenced this earlier in terms of the Obama dilemma, is the very fact of making a public comment can be seen as interference, whether that's from a partisan or from a nonpartisan body. And so we needed to have a way to engage and to share information by which all of the parties would be confident. And of course, what we saw in the US election was that there were very partisan comments on both sides with regards to whether the information should or should not have been released, or even whether a foreign actor should have been named. And so this is a very sensitive and complex issue for which I felt it was really important that it be as nonpartisan as possible, well, completely nonpartisan, and that everybody had comfort in where we were going with it. And of course, it was the very first time we had ever done something like this as well. And so for me, it was really important that all of the political parties, all of the opposition parties had comfort in where we were going.
And in terms of the input and consultation with the political parties, did you receive specific feedback on the particulars of the plan? Like in the composition of panel of 5, for instance, did you specifically elicit feedback or input?
We certainly presented it to them. I wasn't part of those conversations because that was happening at the staff level, but I think, what you could see from the various reports is that going into the 2019 election, there was generally comfort with where we were.
So I want to ask you about the panel of 5. I won't get into the mechanics of it, but the panel is composed of 5 senior public servants. And I understand from your witness statement that for the composition of the panel, you took inspiration from France, who'd used their electoral authority, which was an impartial body of legal advisors to address the Macron leaks. And I understand in terms of the concept stage of the plan, you had considered forming a panel of judges or other eminent Canadians, but ultimately settled on selecting senior public servants. Is that correct?
Correct.
And on what basis did you decide the composition of the panel of 5?
Sure. So the very first point is I felt it was really important that partisans be removed from the process. And so even though I was a minister, still am a minister of the Crown, but was the minister responsible, I was also running in the election. And so any involvement of a partisan, minister, prime minister, during the writ period, during the caretaker convention, for something this sensitive, even if everything was fine, could be seen as having a partisan interest in whether or not information would be released publicly. And so I wanted to remove, that was one of my primary objectives, was to remove any notion that there could be a partisan interest in the decision as to whether or not to release information if something should occur. So I was very interested in what France had in terms of their council of legal advisors. I think colloquially they refer to them as the Conseil d'éminence grise, right? It's folks who are very well respected in France, but it wasn't something new that they had done for that election. This was an institution that they have in place generally. We don't have something like that in Canada. We have Elections Canada. I did consult with Elections Canada. That's not really their role to, determine if there has been foreign interference in an election. They don't necessarily have the capacity to do that. I also consulted with the Commissioner of Canada Elections at the time. Again, not really the right space for them either. And so trying to figure out who would be best placed here. And one of the reasons why I settled on senior public servants who are independent, nonpartisan, professional, is that they would have access to information and understanding of the threat landscape to determine whether something was irregular and whether or not it would have an impact on a free and fair election. And the other part of it, in terms of the composition, was that the government of Canada can be quite siloed sometimes. And so it was important that we brought together those that had access to the information, so the head of CSE, the head of CSIS, who are seeing what's happening and can bring that up to this group quickly, because if something happens, there needs to be a quick decision as to whether it's going to be released publicly or not. So they had access to that information and a very good understanding of the intelligence world and what intelligence could perhaps be linked to evidence, because that's another important piece. Intelligence is not evidence. They need to be certain if they're going to suggest something, because again, the very act of suggesting or making a public declaration will have an impact on the outcome of the election. And then the Deputy Minister for Global Affairs Canada as well, again, because perhaps there are steps that might need to be taken with regards to intelligence that don't merit a public intervention, but maybe there are previous things that could be done, such as like a démarche to an embassy or something of those lines, and they would have an understanding of the global context. And then the NSAI, the clerk of the Privy Council, again, is the most senior public servant, and the deputy for justice. And the reason why I felt it was important, excuse me, to have the deputy for justice there was specifically to have that legal perspective and to have knowledge and understanding of, the corpus of judicial history and precedent in this country, and to ensure that the democratic rights of Canadian citizens, of candidates, of political parties were front and center and understood in making such a profound decision that would have such an important impact on an election process and outcome.
And so with the focus of trying to include non-partisan individuals on the panel, as I understand it, deputy ministers are appointed by the Prime Minister on the advice of the clerk of the Privy Council. Is that correct?
My understanding.
And that appointment is for an indefinite period?
To my knowledge, I'm not involved in that, so, yeah.
Well, the real point being the Prime Minister technically has the power to dismiss a deputy minister. Is that right?
Again, I think so, but that's a bit beyond. But what I would say is that certainly, I'd say every deputy that I have had has served, I think, well under successive governments of different political stripes. And I have, tremendous confidence in their ability to be nonpartisan, independent, and professional. And, many of the deputies that I have had served under conservative governments, and I'm sure many of the deputies that serve under liberal governments will also serve under a future government of a different stripe. That's the role of the public service, is to be professional, to be independent, and to be nonpartisan. And particularly during a writ period where the government is under the Caretaker Convention, and so part of where this panel of 5 fits in is also under the Caretaker Convention, which is something that has existed in Canada since Confederation. Where the public service takes on the responsibilities of the government, because the government is a political actor at that moment in time seeking election or re-election. And so I think it fit very neatly within the existing institutions that we have. And, I would say that, Canadians tend to have confidence in the public service to act in a nonpartisan way.
And so you've indicated that the panel's operational only during the caretaker period. In terms, again, of the concept of the plan, did you consider the creation of a permanent body?
I did not at the time. Remember, again, this is the very first time we're doing something like that. And so I felt it was important that, we establish it, but then there also be a review of the process as it happened, to learn any lessons and provide any recommendations, which ended up being the first JED report, in terms of whether this should be something that we continue with or whether there should be more of a permanence. It was also one of the first times that we had, the second time we had a fixed date election in Canada as well. So there were many kind of different factors. I think in some respects, it's almost a bit harder for foreign actors to interfere when you have, more spontaneous elections. When there's a fixed date, you have a runway to lead up to. And so we were very much learning as we were going, and those lessons, from that should then be applied for future and subsequent elections.
And in terms of a permanent body, my question is also focused on, did you consider the creation of a body that existed outside of the caretaker period, so that would sit for longer than a 6-week period?
No. In the sense, all of those individuals who sit on the panel continue to exercise their responsibilities as respective deputies and heads of agencies. And one would expect that they would continue to talk to each other. However, in the formal capacity, it should only exist during the writ period, because that is the time when people are making decisions about who they are voting for. And either before or after, the government is in place. And my focus in terms of protecting our democracy was specifically with regards to the election event and election events, as opposed to broader foreign interference that happens by attacking government systems or going through other things outside of a writ period. And we have already in the Government of Canada apparatus roles and responsibilities for those activities. What we didn't have was something concrete for the writ period itself.
And so we've heard that the panel's role effectively is to notify the public of an event during the election that threatened Canada's ability to have a free and fair election. And we've also heard evidence that the panel interpreted the threshold for an announcement as being high or very high. In the concept stage, was the threshold intended to be at a high level?
Yes, and it was very important that it's at a high level because, again, remember, the very act of making a decision to announce something publicly could be seen as interference itself. And this is a point that was actually very important for all of the political parties, because for those of us that have run an election or been in an election, either as a candidate or working on it, it's a very intense time. There's a lot of information going around. It is chaotic, so to speak. And so if there's going to be a high, if there's going to be a decision to say, you Canadian citizens, you need to know that a foreign actor has interfered in our election, the threshold needs to be high, because it's resting on the trust of Canadians in the process being, on the integrity of the process. And if someone is saying that the integrity of the process is being questioned or has been compromised, they need to be certain of that fact, and they need to be certain that this is something of significant enough value of the national interest that it be made public. And the political parties were very clear that that was something that was important to them as well.
And when you speak about the integrity of the process and the high threshold, was it contemplated the focus on integrity of the process would be examined at a riding by riding level or a national level?
Both. It could be either, because Canada doesn't have one national election. We have 338 individual elections that make up an electoral event. And so everything is context specific. It could be something that happens at the national level that everybody is aware of or is being impacted by. It could be as something that's happening in one singular riding, but that's where the importance for the panel to have an understanding of the landscape, of the activities, and the potential impact was so important to make that decision. And it was specific in the cabinet directive to give the panel the authority and the responsibility to make that judgment call.
And did you anticipate that the panel could take actions in relation to intelligence or information that fell below the threshold?
Well, that wouldn't be the panel's decision there. That would be up to the individual agencies who have those responsibilities. The panel's primary focus was on whether there was something of such significance that it would have, that it would compromise the free and fair election by Canadians and be in the national interest. And so that was really where the panel's responsibilities lay.
I want to ask you one more briefings related question. Can I have CAN 15506, please? Scroll down, staying on the first page, but scroll down a bit, please. And if we look at the third bullet, it Says prior to and during GE 2019, deputy ministers provided regular briefings on election security to the then Minister of Democratic Institutions, Karina Gould. Were you briefed regularly by deputy ministers prior to and during GE 2019?
Not during. I didn't receive a single briefing during the election.
Did you expect to receive briefings during the election?
I expected not to receive any briefings during the election. I explicitly designed the process so that I would not receive any briefings during the process because, as I mentioned, I had a vested interest in the outcome of the election, and so I felt it would be completely inappropriate to receive those briefings, and that's why it was so important to create this independent, nonpartisan body that would be responsible during the writ period.
And so you've indicated already you're receiving intelligence, it's high level, and no briefings during the writ period. I understand from your witness summary that you did not receive any intelligence during the writ period relating to allegations in Don Valley North, is that correct?
Correct.
And I understand as well that you were not aware that secret cleared Liberal Party representatives were briefed in relation to allegations of interference in the Don Valley North nomination contest?
That is correct. Again, as I created this system and policy, it was very important that each of the political parties had their own doors into the security agencies, that the government, myself as Minister of Democratic Institution, would not be aware of, so that they would have trust to have that engagement with the security agencies.
And I understand, finally, that you were not briefed on intelligence assessments suggesting that there were likely at least 2 transfers of funds approximating $250,000 from PRC officials in Canada, possibly for FI-related purposes, that were transferred via an influential community leader to the staff member of a 2019 federal election and then to an Ontario MPP.
That is correct.
So you did not receive that intelligence?
No, I would have received something at a much higher level.
And were you briefed on a TRM conducted in advance of GE 43 to reduce the FI threat posed by the government of Pakistan?
At a very high level, but I wouldn't have received information as to what or with whom.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cross-examination by counsel for Jenny Kwan.
Good morning, Commissioner. Good morning, Ms. Gould.
Good morning.
Just going to take a minute here to... So, Ms. Gould, this morning I wanted to ask questions specifically related to the kind of information that you considered when you were developing the threshold and sort of considering the plan for protecting Canada's democracy. In your witness statement, and you've said this in your testimony as well, that your briefings were quite high level, that you actually looked outside of Canada to see the ways in which foreign interference had affected elections. Do you think it would have been helpful to know the specific details, though, of foreign interference in Canada so that you could better address what was happening here, because perhaps the dynamics would have been different than perhaps our US partners or other countries in the world?
Okay, well, I want to take you back to 2017 for a moment, because it was the first time that we were thinking about foreign interference in terms of cybersecurity. And it was the first time that we were seeing these wide-scale attacks around the world in real time. Typically, foreign interference before was very, very covert, right? And human to human. Right? We weren't seeing this kind of hacking of systems, divulging of information, trying to pollute the information ecosystem as we were at the time. And so it was incredibly important to learn from real world examples that we were seeing happening to figure out what we needed to do here at home to avoid something like that in the future. Of course, I was briefed at a high level as to what foreign interference activities attempts at foreign interference, I should say, were seen here in Canada. So I would correct a little bit the premise of your question and say that, yes, both of those were happening. And that was incredibly important to figure out how we protect ourselves. Also, the understanding is that threat actors don't often act the same way twice, because once they've been found out to do one thing, they don't necessarily continue to do that activity. And so you're constantly trying to keep up and understand what potential new things are happening. No one before the US presidential election thought that Russia was using Facebook and Twitter and posing as Americans through their bot farms at the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. All of that was learned after the fact. So it was really important to have that understanding in order to develop a plan to protect ourselves as best as we can.
I appreciate the helpful answer. And so just to disentangle that a bit so that we have an understanding, when you say you were being briefed at a high level of what was happening in Canada, is it fair to say that you were being briefed on the way in which foreign interference happens, the modes, who the players might be in the Canadian landscape, but not necessarily on specific events? Just so, I mean, to the extent
so
that you
it
can
would be
answer.
high level in the sense of which are the foreign actors that try to engage the most in foreign interference activities, and some of the ways in which the agencies would have seen them try to do that. So there was an understanding of what the threats are in Canada. I would say that generally speaking, and as I mentioned in my previous answer, it is known that there have been attempts to interfere in Canadian democracy since the beginning of Confederation. But I would say that our intelligence agencies are, I think, quite adept at trying to monitor that, and if they're able to then share that information with the RCMP, whose job would be then, if they have the evidence, to act upon it.
Okay, so if I think I understand your testimony to be that you did have some understanding of the ways in which FI operated here, who the threat actors might be, and so over the course of the last few weeks in this commission, we've learned that foreign interference can be very discrete events that perhaps on their own don't add up to very much, but in the aggregate do. Did you have a similar understanding of foreign interference at the time that you developed this particular threshold and plan?
Yes, could be. However, I would say that the emphasis on this plan was certainly with regards to cyber security, but also understanding the entirety of how foreign actors could interfere in an electoral event, and ensuring that the respective agencies had the tools that they needed to be able to act upon it when they had the evidence to act upon it.
Okay, so it does sound like you had a similar understanding that perhaps, one WeChat post doesn't do much, but you add them all up together and there's a collective impact of that.
Could be or could not be.
Right.
Right? Everything is context specific. And it's very hard to say that this one particular thing might have an impact, or as I was saying in my testimony earlier, the threshold, for example, for the panel was very high, but it could have been something that happened in one riding, or it could have been something that happened at a national level. It would be completely context specific.
That's fair. So then, given how context specific everything is, and you have that same understanding, did you consider a sliding scale approach that could adapt to that context so that the threshold wasn't so high, but perhaps if it were triggered at different levels, a different level of response could address the situation?
I'll just push back gently a bit because, again, you can't really have a sliding scale because, again, you can't really imagine exactly what's going to happen during the election because, as I said, threat actors are going to change. For example, they're watching these proceedings right now and are likely going to be changing how they're acting in Canada as they're seeing how we are responding in this very setting. So the panel did a series of tabletop exercises to imagine different scenarios, right? The site task force imagined different scenarios and how they might react. But again, it will all depend on that exact moment, what is happening, and the context in which it is happening. So you can't really have a rubric to say if X, then Y and Z. Because if you did, you might end up interfering in an election that you maybe didn't need to in terms of saying something publicly, because the context will depend on what is happening in that moment. So I know that you would like to have a rubric and a box that says this is what you need to act when, but it's really important that there's that discretion and that judgment in place before something is made public.
Actually, I will agree with you that a rubric and a box is probably not possible given the amount of ways in which you could interfere. But what I mean more is sort of a sliding scale in the way that the national terrorism threat levels exist. There's different threat levels and there are different responses as a result. And so not only would you have a sliding scale with respect to when to respond, but how to respond so that you're not necessarily interfering. And again, not at the minutia of, if X happens, you do Y, leaving, of course, a great degree of discretion, but that way there's no under or overreaction to a particular
I don't
event.
think you would ever be able to determine if there's an under or an overreaction because of the nature of an election when emotions are so high, when the outcome is so personal to so many people and it has such a great impact on the country that you're going to be able to be in a place where everyone says, oh, because you followed the sliding scale, we're okay with it. That's kind of the crux of the Obama dilemma. He saw what was happening, understood what was happening, didn't feel that he could say something because he was worried that by the very fact of saying something publicly, he would have an impact on the outcome. And so what I would say to you is that those rubrics, those responses, on a more granular level already exist within the agencies, and they already have ways to deal with things that happen on a more minor level, and they make those decisions as to how and when to respond and react in a way that hopefully doesn't further compromise the national security of Canada and of Canadians, but also the integrity of the electoral process.
I really do appreciate your answer, and despite the follow-up, I doubt I can ask a question in 8 seconds, so thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you. Counsel for Michael Chung.
Good morning, Commissioner. Good morning, Minister Gould.
Morning.
Ms. Morgan asked you about consultation with political parties regarding the critical election incident public protocol. You remember that?
I do.
And I believe your evidence is, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but your evidence on that was we presented it to them. And I want to ask you if you'd agree that presenting a plan is quite different from meaningful consultation on a plan.
So we had conversations first before the plan was presented, and I'll take you back to my testimony earlier with Ms. Morgan where I said the first conversations we had were likely in the fall of 2017, and the plan was made public in January of 2019. So throughout that period of time, there were ongoing conversations with the political parties, first to understand what some of their issues and challenges were, to get their level of comfort. So for example, one of the pieces was CSE offered to do technical audits of their systems. I don't think a single political party agreed to that because they didn't want the government to go in there, but they did say one thing that would be helpful would be to have a list of trusted vendors. So there was a continuous dialogue and engagement as we were building the plan. And then it was presented in its final stage when it was public in the winter of 2019.
That's helpful, and I just want to make sure that we have your evidence because my specific concern is not on the plan as a whole, but is on the panel of 5, the critical election incident public protocol. And so I believe that's what, in response to Ms. Morgan's question, you said we presented it to them. And I'm wondering on that, on the panel of 5, was there meaningful consultation with the political parties, or was the plan just presented to them as you had created it?
I couldn't tell you the exact conversations because the conversation that I had specifically was in the fall of 2017, and then after that, it would have been at the staff level.
Okay. And so can you point to any specific suggestions made by opposition parties that made their way into the cabinet directive on the panel?
There was a general acceptance, and I didn't receive any pushback at the time, that public servants that there was no pushback that these public servants be on that panel.
Okay. And I have a question about the public servants on the panel. You say that, so the panel is the clerk, the NSIA, and 3 deputy ministers, correct? You say that they're all nonpartisan, and we certainly would expect them to be, but you also referred to them as independent. So I want to ask a question about that. Would you agree there's an important difference between a nonpartisan at-pleasure appointee and a public office with true institutional independence from government?
I would say that as your client was Minister of Democratic Reform, who served alongside and was served by the professional nonpartisan public service, that they are independent in the advice that they provide to government. They are loyal in the implementation of it. But I have very, very strong confidence in our public service that they serve the government of the time, but they serve equally well regardless of what the partisan color of that government is.
And I appreciate that, but that's not quite my question, which is just there's a key difference between an at-pleasure appointee who can be removed and an office with institutional independence. I can give you a couple examples. Judges would be an example. They cannot be removed. The office of the Chief Electoral Officer of Elections Canada, who serves a 10-year non-renewable term, has institutional independence. You'd agree there's a difference between that kind of institutional independence and at-pleasure deputy minister appointees?
I think that what you're getting at is not quite appropriate in the sense of public servants are nonpartisan, and while yes, the very heads of them could be removed, it is not something that I think is the right way to frame this, because they are responsible first and foremost to protecting Canada. That is their job, and protecting the institution of government. And that is something that they take very seriously. And they are not partisan in nature, and particularly during the caretaker period, which is a long-standing convention in Canadian governance, they take on the role of a government at that time, and particularly in this cabinet directive, they are given that authority. If you look at the cabinet directive, yes, they inform the Prime Minister, but they also have to inform the other political parties as well, to make sure that this is something that is fair and information that is being received by everyone ahead of it being made public.
So I appreciate all that. I just want to try one more time, because I have your evidence on the nonpartisanship, and I'm not asking questions about that. I'm wanting to ask questions on the independent. So perhaps I can put it this way. There's a difference between a at-pleasure appointee who can be removed at pleasure and the institutional independence that, say, a judge or the Chief Electoral Officer of Elections Canada has. You'd acknowledge that?
Yes, there is a difference. However, in this instance, these are very professional individuals who take their job of being nonpartisan, professional public servants very seriously, and whose primary responsibility is protecting Canadians, Canada, and our governing institutions.
Thank you, Minister Gould. That's very helpful. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Counsel for Erin O'Toole.
Good morning, Minister Gould. My name is Tom Jarman. I'm counsel for Erin O'Toole. So let's go back to the panel of 5 and the threshold, which I'm sure everybody will regret me getting into. you set by, and the panel of 5 has said it was a high threshold. They've said need reliable information. Your words this morning, they needed to be certain. Is that correct?
Correct.
So it's by design you've got that particular way. I would submit to you that, in fact, what you've done is you've institutionalized the Obama dilemma. Because on October 7th, 2016, the Obama administration actually told the American public that Russia was interfering in the election. And the subsequent criticism of him and his administration was that he took so long to do it while they were looking for certainty. Are you aware of that?
I've read all of the public information about it.
Okay, but you're aware that, in fact, the Obama administration did alert the U.S. citizenry about intervention in the 2016 election, prior to the election?
I don't recall exactly that moment yet.
Thank you. Could we go to your witness statement, wit 62, at paragraph 7? Now, the second paragraph, this is the discussion about the your initiatives with Facebook, Microsoft, and Twitter in order to come to a voluntary, I guess, regime to address information manipulation. Mm-hmm. And those were, did you negotiate with any other platforms or approach any other platforms?
Facebook, Microsoft, Twitter, and Google were the main interlocutors. I know that PCO approached other social media platforms, but it was harder to engage with them because they didn't have representatives in Canada.
Okay, so no one approached Tencent about WeChat?
I don't think they had an office in Canada at the time. And I would say at the time in 2019, the primary focus was really on Russia.
Okay. I'll put those other questions to other individuals in. I'd like to look at paragraph 11 of the witness summary. And you speak there about interference in the nomination process. And I see the statement that alleged interference in a nomination process would not be significant enough to question the integrity of an election in its entirety. But it would be sufficient enough to question the integrity of the election in the particular riding, wouldn't it?
Well, there are agencies that already have responsibility for that specific instance. So political parties are responsible for nominations. Elections Canada has rules and laws already, and the
Sorry,
RCMP.
excuse me. How is Elections Canada responsible in nominations process?
Well,
just remind him that my friend is not entitled to cross-examine on a witness statement pursuant to your rules as well. He can ask for clarification. He can use a statement as a basis to form a defense on questions. He's not entitled to cross-examine on a particular statement from a witness.
Well,
So rephrase your question, I think.
I was to say, in that statement, it said that Elections Canada, the remits of the affected political party, Elections Canada, and or the RCMP. How is Elections Canada, this within the remit of Elections Canada?
well, for a nomination process, it would be the political party itself that is responsible. And of course, if they were breaking the law by having, let's say, foreign money involved, which would be illegal under the Canada Elections Act, then the RCMP or the police of jurisdiction would have the authority to act on that.
So I was going to say, Elections Canada, it's the financial operation of the campaign, and the RCMP, it's acts of fraud or things like that.
Well, as you know, we have a separation of government and law enforcement in this country. So yes, the RCMP would respond if it was known a law was broken or suspected a law was broken.
And just going to the threshold for another second, with respect to the balancing of these things, we see the effect on discourse at the general level on the election, at the riding level, but what about the effect on political discourse? If foreign interference affects the political discourse, is that an impact on an election?
context specific again. So it could be certainly what we saw in the US presidential election. It was. Again, though, as anyone who has run in an election, the information ecosystem is quite chaotic during a writ period. And so to be able to determine if it was foreign interference that caused a change in the discourse or it was something else, a statement by a politician, a policy from a political party, a platform from a political party, there needs, it's hard to determine which one of those things might be the most effective. However, that's where the involvement of the intelligence agencies and intelligence that they see impacting something would then be submitted to the panel to make that judgment call. But again, it's very context specific, and it's one of the biggest challenges and one of the reasons why I believe, Russia, particularly in the lead up to the 2016 election, used social media so effectively. But you can't necessarily say that Russia was responsible or their information caused the outcome of the 2016 election. Because remember, at the end of the day, I believe this very strongly, we need to protect Canadian citizens to give them the tools and the information to make informed decisions. And at the end of the day, if they go into that ballot box and no one has told them how to vote or is holding them to vote a certain way or bribing them, but rather they are going and making a decision based on the information that they have, that vote is valid. And the outcome of that vote is valid because that is a decision a Canadian has made. And so to be able to determine specifically that they got there because of one specific element in an election is quite challenging, which is why the threshold was set so high and why the intervention of the panel needed to be taken with the seriousness with which I think it was taken.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you. Counsel for the Conservative Party, Ms. DeLuca.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm going to quote from your 2017 mandate letter from the Prime Minister, which says, as Minister of Democratic Institutions, your overarching goal was to strengthen the openness and fairness of Canada's public institutions and also to restore Canadians' trust and participation in our democratic processes. Do you recall that? Do you recall those words?
Would you be able to show them to me?
I would, but I don't have a note right now of the document. It was part of it.
If you could show it to me, that would be helpful.
Sure.
COM 18.
And do you know which paragraph?
Scroll up. Keep going. Well, why don't we do it this way? Do you believe that the prospect of foreign interference, to the extent and to the extent that it actually took place in our elections, is contrary to the mandate that the Prime Minister charged you with?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure. To the extent that foreign interference actually took place in the 2019, that would have been contrary to what you were charged with safeguarding against in your mandate.
Well, my job was to come up with a plan and a policy to try as best as possible to prevent foreign interference. It doesn't mean that there weren't ongoing attempts, as I mentioned at the outset, of foreign interference throughout all elections. But perhaps I can just get to your first point, because one of the reasons why I was mandated to restore trust in democracy was because at the time we were when we were elected, it was after the Fair Elections Act that the current leader of the opposition had put in place, which actually reduced citizens' ability to cast their ballots. And that was the primary overarching objective, was to make sure that every Canadian citizen would be able to cast their ballot, be able to participate in our democracy, and have confidence in the process.
Can I ask that MMC 5020 be pulled up? And do you have it in front of you?
I think so.
And this appears to be a summary of the CSIS briefings in the possession of the Privy Council Office relating to PRC foreign interference in the 2019 and 2021 general elections, and a general description of those documents. And can by my count, between June 2018 and August 2019, you received 7 briefings on foreign election interference. Does that sound right?
Yes, and I would just gently correct you in the sense that I'm not sure this is specifically related to the PRC. It would have been an overall look at foreign interference generally from a variety of actors.
Well, the heading actually says PRC. Do you dispute that?
I don't see that here.
At the top, CSIS
Yeah.
briefings and intelligence products on PRC foreign interference. This is the heading of the document.
Okay, sorry, I didn't see that.
Okay.
But I would just say that those briefings that I would have received would have been general with regards to a variety of factors.
Okay. And safe to say that, at least as a result of those briefings, you are well aware of the issue of foreign interference in Canadian elections?
I would say that to make the statement that there is foreign interference in Canadian elections is not entirely accurate. I would say that what these briefings suggested to me, were provided to me, was an overview of attempted foreign interference broadly around the world, as well as activities that potentially could be observed here in Canada.
So you received, let me get this straight, you received 7 briefings on foreign interference. Are you suggesting that as a result of those 7 briefings, you weren't convinced that any foreign interference
I did not say that.
Let me finish the question, please. Are you suggesting that you weren't convinced that any foreign interference had taken place in connection with the Canadian elections process?
What I said was they would show me, they would share information with me of what potential interference could be, of activities that they had seen as attempts and things that we needed to be aware of in terms of what could possibly happen during an election. Certainly, I was the Minister of Democratic Institutions before the 2021 election and for a very brief period of time after the 2019 election.
You're not suggesting that attempts at foreign interference have to be successful and have to actually materially impact the result before they're taken seriously or they're dealt with?
I'm not. And in fact, we are here right now today because we took attempts at foreign interference very seriously. It's why I was mandated to do it in 2017, and it's why I came up with that plan to protect Canadian democracy. We did take it extremely seriously. It's why we're here today. It's why we're actually looking at documents that were prepared with regards to foreign interference, something I will note the previous Conservative government didn't do.
Can I ask you to turn up CAN 004252? And this indicates that it's a briefing or it's a briefing or a security brief that you would have received in or about October 29, 2019 from CSIS. Did you in fact receive this briefing?
I did receive a briefing following the 2019 election. I couldn't confirm the date with you, and I have only seen this particular document in preparation for today's proceedings.
If we could perhaps scroll to page 3 of this document. October 29, 2019 would have been after the 2019 election, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And at the bottom of page 3, there's a discussion of a China threat update. You see that? And part of it has been redacted.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recall being updated with respect to the China threat on or about October 29, 2019 after the general election?
I would have been briefed at a very high level that they were monitoring the activities. Yeah.
Okay. And within, or just, I guess it's after the third redacted box, there's the tail end of an explanation regarding what it says, limited specific incidents suggested of FI, which were briefed to relevant clients, GC and political parties during the writ period, e.g. Don Valley. Do you recall receiving that briefing or that information as part of this October 29, 2019?
It would have
briefing?
been a high level. I wouldn't have received the specifics about Don Valley and would have said something to the effect of limited activity viewed, action taken, but it wouldn't have been to that specific level.
Okay, so I just want to be clear though, when what you just described as what you would have received would have been only at this briefing? Or
it would have been all of the briefings. It was high level. I was never given specifics about candidates, parties, locations, or individuals.
Were you given specifics as part of this briefing?
No.
Were you given even generalities relating to voting irregularities for Don Valley North?
No.
Prior to this briefing?
No.
Let me finish.
Oh, well, okay, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Those are my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maître Sirois for RCDA.
Good morning.
Minister Gould, you mentioned during your examination in chief that the primary national interest of Russia involves inciting chaos within democratic nations, right?
One of them, yes.
Including the 43rd and 44th general election.
I wouldn't know that specific for those elections because I was not the Minister of Democratic Institutions at the time. But what I can say is it doesn't necessarily mean that that was their objective in Canada, but that has been one of their objectives in terms of why they engage in cyber activities during election periods in democracies.
So your evidence is that Russia has an objective in interfering, a national interest in interfering in democratic nations, but perhaps not Canada.
Canada is a democratic nation. It's a member of NATO, and so therefore we need to be alert and aware. It doesn't mean that Canada is necessarily the main focus, but certainly what we see in democratic countries around the world, one of the objectives that Russia has is creating chaos.
Maybe Canada is not the main focus, but it's certainly one of the focus.
I couldn't necessarily say that. I mean, we would have to have evidence of that, and I'm not sure that that's something that I'm allowed to talk about.
Yes, that's the thing. My question is not about whether we have evidence or not. My question is more on Russia's intent in interfering in democratic nations, as you testified about this morning. And so I'll just ask the question again, just to be sure I understand. Are you saying that Russia does not interfere in Canada, or does not have the intent of interfering in Canada, but has the intent of interfering in other democratic nations?
I think Russia has the intent of interfering in most democratic nations, particularly those that are members of NATO.
but not the 43rd and 44th general election in Canada.
I wouldn't be able to say I wasn't, I was Minister of Democratic Institutions before those events took place.
Understand.
But certainly Russia was something that we were concerned about, which is why we created this whole infrastructure to protect our elections.
You suspected that Russia may have an intent?
To be prepared.
Yeah. Okay. And I wanted to move now to the threshold, just with a little time I have left. There's a degree of subjectivity when determining whether the high threshold has been met, right? That's why you have 5 different panel members. Yeah. Yes?
Yes.
Is it possible that for different members of the Canadian public, also there's different conceptions of what a high threshold is? I'm thinking in particular with respect to diaspora members. For instance, maybe a pro-democracy diaspora member may think that the high threshold has been met by a certain situation, but that same conclusion may not be reached by the panel of 5.
Certainly, I think for different actors, there would be different expectations as to when that is met, but that's why we created a panel of 5 so that they could have that conversation and determine when to make a public announcement of something. Because it is a very complicated, emotional, high energy moment that has a huge impact. So that's why it was important to be able to have a group that could make that determination.
It's possible that the group concludes that the high threshold hasn't been met, although with the same information, someone from a diaspora group may conclude that the high threshold has been met.
I guess what I would say to that is that the panel is put in place specifically to determine if that threshold meets the fact that a free and fair election has been compromised, the ability to have one, and that it's in the national interest to release this information publicly.
Well, I know why the panel of 5 has been created. That's clear, and thanks to you. I just want to understand whether it's possible for the panel to reach one conclusion with respect to the threshold and a member of the diaspora community to reach a different conclusion with respect to the threshold.
With all due respect, I'm the member of the diaspora community is not necessarily charged with protecting Canada's democracy. And so their understanding of when and what to say publicly may be different. I will certainly grant you that. But I think what's important here is that we have a group of the highest ranking public servants in the country who determine when that needs to be released publicly.
Well, I'm out of time, but I thank you. Merci, Madame la Commissaire.
Yes. Counsel for UCC.
Good morning, Minister Gould.
Good morning.
John Duty, I'm counsel for the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. We've heard from you and others that the motivation to create the plan to protect Canada's democracy was due to Russia's interference in the US and around the world. From when you got that mandate in 2017 and leading up to the 2019 election, did you see that concern decrease or increase from Russia specifically?
Well, I'm not sure I can comment on specific intelligence.
No, but I mean Russia, the country.
But what I can say is, well, I think that would maybe be classified information, but what I can say is that I remained very concerned as I continued to learn that this is something that Canada needed to do, and we needed to make sure that we had a plan and a process in place.
Okay. And you stated in your testimony this morning that in every election, there's been attempts at foreign interference, but whether they're successful or not is another issue. Mm-hmm. So do you believe that there were attempts by Russia to interfere in the 2019 and 21 election in Canada?
I don't think I can comment on that.
So you believe that every election there's attempts, but you don't know about these two with Russia?
Well, I don't think I can comment on that.
And you said in response to a question by Councilor Mr. O'Toole that as long as a Canadian voter, make sure I understand this, goes to the voter box with their own understanding of the issues without direct foreign interference, that is a valid vote.
Yes, I mean, if you consider an election, a writ period, there's a lot of information that is spread even by domestic actors that is not necessarily true. But the fact of the matter is you know, unless you can tie it specifically to a foreign actor, it's hard to determine that that is what made them cast that ballot. So one of the reasons why one of the pillars in the plan to protect democracy was about informing citizens is so that citizens can have the tools to be able to identify information, see valid sources, and that's also the reason why we invited the NATO Stratcom to come talk to Canadian journalists as well, so that they, as arbiters of information, can hopefully provide the best sources to Canadian citizens.
But in that scenario, if the understanding of that voter is incorrect due to misinformation or disinformation being spread by a foreign state, would that vote still be valid?
If that citizen cast that ballot, yes. And they were not forced to cast that ballot. I mean, at the end of the day, Canadian citizens make decisions on their votes based on a wide range of issues, wide range of access to information. There's plenty of stuff out there right now that's false, that's informing people, that's spread by domestic actors, right? So it's, at the end of the day, if a Canadian has made that decision, that their vote is valid. What we are trying to do, or what I was trying to do, was to set up an infrastructure to enable Canadians to make informed choices and have an understanding of where that information was coming from.
Thank you.
Council for Human Rights Coalition.
Good morning. If the court operator could please pull up HRC 31. This is the Liberal Party of Canada bylaw governing procedure for the Permanent Appeals Committee. And if we could jump to 3.1 at the bottom of page 1. It states that 2 co-chairs are appointed by the National Board with the consent of the leader. Minister, would that be the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada?
So I will just say that before appearing here, I have never read this bylaw before. I would assume it's the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, but this is, I think, more a question for the party apparatus as opposed to a minister.
Okay, we can move on.
Yeah.
Could we please pull up next CAN 4079_R01? And if we could go to the top of page 2, please. Thank you. It reads, the PRC is known to target and or leverage family as part of its FI, meaning foreign interference, and other threat activity through operations Fox Hunt and Skynet, for example. The PRC could potentially threaten or intimidate redacted. What are your thoughts on this, Minister?
Sorry, could you go to the top of this briefing note for me? I'm not sure
And my apologies, the document doesn't have identification in the database as to what intelligence body prepared it. So I'm not able to tell you.
I'm not sure I've seen this document before. If that's the correct date, then that's after the time that I was Minister of Democratic Institutions.
Would you be able to speak from, my understanding is that you have received high-level briefings about actors involved in potential foreign interference and the ways that they engage in that foreign interference. Would you be able to speak to the issue of the PRC targeting and or leveraging family as part of the foreign interference, as part of its foreign interference in your role before that? If we speak about it more generally?
I can speak more generally about my time as Minister of Democratic Institutions. This is something that I have not seen before or been presented with.
Have you been presented with information that speaks to the PRC leveraging or threatening family?
No.
Okay, so your answer is simply you aren't in a position to discuss or answer questions because you have not received information about this issue.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. AG?
Good morning, Commissioner. Good morning, Minister. I just have 2 clarification questions. You were taken to, and we can pull this up if we need to, you were taken to CAN 004252, which is a security briefing dated October 29th, 2019, which you, I believe your testimony was you weren't sure if you remembered that the security briefing took place on that date.
Correct.
And you recall being asked about your state of knowledge regarding Don Valley North. Can you just confirm for the record, as Minister of Democratic Institutions, did you have responsibility and/or accountability to address any alleged incidents of foreign interference that would have flowed in respect of Don Valley North?
No.
And can you tell us which minister or which portfolio might have been responsible?
I would think it would be the Minister of Public Safety. However, I believe that would, if there was something that happened, that would be the purview of the RCMP, because they would be the ones that would respond in such an instance, because
Thank you,
the law
Minister.
would be broken. Yeah.
Thank you. Re-examination.
No.
So it's, we'll break for 20, we are starting with another witness, so I think it will be 11:30. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Order, please.
And
Alors,
you're
s'il vous
free to
plaît.
go.
The sitting of the Foreign Interference Commission is now in recess until 11:20. La séance est en pause jusqu'à 11h20.